Welcome to all our listeners to the New Lyre podcast. My name is David Gosselin. I'm the editor of New Lyre. And I have here returning our guest, Adam Sedia. Welcome, Adam.
Good to be here again.
So Adam is a poet, essayist, contributor to the Chained Muse poetry website, which is another poetry website that we founded, where we are promoting and we publish what we like to call 21st century classical poetry. So I think this is a very important question because in the last century, the world of art and culture has been dominated by a modernist and postmodernist outlook. Postmodernists grew out of the modernist outlook, and we have contemporary art today. And there's been a whole arc of aesthetical, theoretical, and philosophical development, which we want to understand, put in perspective, and really look at from the standpoint of where we are today in the 21st century and what the role of art should be. What is the role of art in the 21st century? What has it been? And just trying to understand how are works of classical art created? What does it mean to create a new classic, right? What is a classic? It's not just a question of time or place. There's a reason that we still read Shakespeare, even if the language is archaic and very different from the way we would express an idea today, perhaps. The point is that there's something higher. There's something beyond the words, beyond the lines. And it's that immaterial idea which really defines that's what makes a work a classic. That's what makes it outlast its own age and time.
And I would just add that the goal of this all is to make art relevant again, to make it speak to the deepest needs and desires and ideas of the human condition without having to turn to another time and place, to bring art into step with where we are today and where we're moving forward. Because I think after modernism and what came after it, we've seen a great stagnation in artistic development and almost an atrophy in artistic imagination. And I think our goal is at least to help rekindle that original spark of artistic creativity in the classical context.
Yeah, I mean, the question really is, what is creativity? Because I mean, if we just say, I can just hear, what we're saying, and there's somebody's going to ask, well, there's tons of art all around us. There's all sorts of different things. So how can you say that there's a lack of creativity? I watch Netflix and Amazon Prime, and there's all sorts of shows about all sorts of subjects. So the idea that there's no creativity or imagination, how can you say that?
Well, okay, and I should be clarified. I think what we're talking about is in terms of high art versus popular art, which isn't to say that what you can find on Netflix or Amazon doesn't have artistic merit. It's meant for popular consumption rather than high artistic expression. And we can talk about what we mean by that.
Right. I mean, that's really the question. Who was modernist poetry? Who was T.S. Eliot writing for? Who was his audience? Who was Virginia Woolf writing for? Who was Yeats writing for?
And those were not by any means intended for popular consumption. If you want to read poets and poetry, that there was a such thing in those days as poetry meant for popular consumption. I mean, the closest thing you come to that now is like Dr. Seuss or something for children. But you would look at I can't remember his name. anyone who would appear in Harper's Weekly or one of the big publications. When T.S. Eliot, the founders of modernism, those were in the tradition of high art, where there was a limited an intentionally limited audience, limited by having the ability, the background, the education, the cultural experience to fully understand the work.
Right. I mean, I think, yeah, I think it's an important distinction, when we say, well, what is art? If we recognize the fact that there is something, especially in the 20th century, I think we could say, there's been this phenomena of mass culture, of popular culture, of like top 40 hits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the music that, what's pop music? Pop music is for, quote unquote, the average person or something. And, then you have this other music that's for people with different sorts of interests and whatnot. But there's this very sort of homogenizing effect in pop culture. And it doesn't really, when we're talking about high art, right, the difference is that it's speaking to a different part of human beings in many cases, at least, not in all, but it's posing certain questions of it's posing certain universal paradoxes, certain things that address the inner being of a human being, which in pop culture is usually reduced to just some sort of formulaic approach that's sort of just,
Well, in pop culture, it's meant to be easily digestible because you don't want it's meant to be an escape and a form of entertainment. It's not meant to create more problems than it solves, so to speak. That's the difference between Shakespeare and Game of Thrones, for instance. Game of Thrones might have a very entertaining story and engaging performances, but ultimately it's what you see is what you get. It's a surface level drama. And I don't want to cast aspersions at anyone's work with this, but with Shakespeare, you have those multiple levels. You have the facial surface action, but then you have everything you don't see and that isn't spoken in the lines of the play, and that's what gives the play its depth, the work its depth, and what makes it a classic, because there is always a fresh spring of ideas coming out of those.
Right. And I mean, yeah, I think this idea of escape is important. I mean, I think a lot of people might not like this idea or find it uncomfortable, but a lot of popular culture really has more to do with escaping reality than anything else. And it's become increasingly popular to find new ways of escaping, right? The art is always their TV productions and all that. The cinema industry, they're just looking to pull more people in, and ultimately it's finding ways to distract them
and they freely admit that too. I find one of the interesting admissions you get with all of like the NFL or sports or movies or whatever. One of the main complaints you get is, these were designed to be an escape, and all you're doing is dragging the outside problems into it. And I think that's very revealing about what popular art and popular culture is.
Right. And I mean, from this standpoint, we can maybe, as a first approximation, high art is the opposite of that. It's the things that you are trying to run from. It's the greater questions, greater problems facing the human species. And how is it that a master tragedian, for example, or an immortal poet, how are they going to deal with these questions? How do they approach these questions? And I mean, I think it's important because we're talking about something higher than what we can touch, taste, hear, see, or smell. All these things are relative. We all have different traditions. We have different, we use
and
different words.
and going back, I mean, think of, I just had this thought pop into my head and I don't want to lose it. Think
Yeah,
of the Greek tragedies. These were, I mean, you don't go to these to escape. You don't watch them to feel good at the end of the day. And in their original context, they were designed as religious ritual. They were not an escape. They had a very deep meaning, where the play, the acting itself served a function to connect the audience with the divine originally. And you can make an argument that is the purpose of great art in any culture.
right. And I mean, yeah, we have to look at this higher question because, for example, Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare's talking about kings and princes and, peasants in, horse carts and whatever. We don't have any of these things. So, I mean, if that's the level at which we're supposed to relate to it, it's unrelatable. I mean, I don't have a horse wagon. I don't have all these problems, I don't have a fireplace. Okay, we have electricity, so that's pretty different. I live in.
I do have a fireplace.
I live in a pretty different world. Maybe you're a bit closer, but I suspect that your world as a lawyer in Indiana is also quite different from a Shakespearean prince. But that gets to the point. So why do we still read Shakespeare? There's something more that's not about, just how to act if I were a prince or how to act if I were a king. I'd like to think that there's something more. And what is that? How do we understand that? And it's a struggle. I mean, that's the whole point, that this kind of high art is posing real paradoxes. It has real ironies, which are real in terms of history, in terms of the nature of human beings. And they do take work. You can't escape. It's not an escape. It's going to take work. But that's the whole point. It's doing something different. And I mean, I just as an example, because we're saying universals, but I mean, I like to think of this idea that regardless of whether we're Christian, we're Muslim, we're conservatives, we're Buddhists, we're atheists, we're liberals, we're conservatives, we're modernists, we're existentialists, we're classicists. There are certain things that there are certain paradoxes that we all have to face regardless. For example, we're all mortal. Each human being is mortal, but the individual is mortal, but the species continues even after we're gone. The species is essentially immortal, or it can be immortal. If you look at the universe, sure, Einstein spoke of this idea that the universe is finite but unbounded. Yes, at any given moment, the world is in a given state, but the potentiality, the future, right, by its nature, the universe is creative and it's changing. Life is changing. Life has always been evolving. The record of life is a record of change and development. It's not this static sort of just repeat. It's not a cycle. There's qualitative changes going on. And so I think there's a question of transcendentals which all human beings are faced with, and these are the kinds of questions, statecraft, what does a civilization need to survive? What kinds of ideas will allow a civilization to survive versus the kinds of ideas that cause a civilization to collapse. Civilizations have collapsed. And if we look at Shakespeare, we see a lot of this. There's often in high school and in literary courses and all that, there's a lot of discussion about the characters, right? And their problems, their personal problems, and all the messes that creates. But people tend to forget that these are unfolding against a backdrop of a nation, right? A nation in trouble, a civilization in trouble, like in Hamlet. Denmark is threatened with invasion by Fortinbras, and Hamlet is caught in this whole personal struggle. But while he's caught in that personal struggle, all these things are happening outside beyond the scope of his attention, because his identity is located in certain particulars, which
Well, and I think that's why Shakespeare, and the Greek tragedians before him made royalty the subject of their plays, is because they're in a position where their actions as individual human beings determine the course of history and of the state. You could even take this further and go into the whole Golden Bough James Fraser analysis, where where the king is the carries the how do you say, the entire well-being of the nation
Mhm.
in his person, and if he fails or is weakened or incompetent, then the whole nation suffers as a result. And there is some truth to that, and that's why, in Shakespeare you see, I mean, these are very human. They're just like any of us, but they're in a position where the actions they take affect their whole society. And for an individual, all you do is shrink that sphere of influence, and it's the same. It's the same applicable lesson. I mean, what we do affects those around us, those who know us, those who might depend on us. Not It's just when you're in the position of royalty, that sphere is larger, and that's part of what creates the universality of these stories. I mean, it's all of our stories just writ large.
Mhm. And I mean, I think, yeah, because people watching this, right? We're talking. You gave the example. That these decisions are being made by princes and kings, and the course of history is being shaped. The history of Denmark is being shaped. But the point is that the way Shakespeare is treating these things, what's really shaping the course of events and the behavior of the characters are the axioms, are the assumptions that these characters have. And Shakespeare is exploring, like a scientist, what happens if this person doesn't change his or her axioms? What are the consequences of believing that his or her political, the political dynamics of their time is such and such, depending on what their assumptions are about the world they're living in, this is going to define their actions. So, I mean, what about just an audience of people, of students watching this? Is the lesson, well, oh, these are insights for kings and princes. These are insights for decision makers, but we're not decision makers, so these insights don't apply. No, it's the opposite. It's that what allows people to have a sort of historical bearing on the world, to have an impact, is really being able to act on the level of ideas. And depending on what kinds of ideas are in your head, those shape your sphere of action. If you want to change your relationship to the world, it's based on changing your axioms, changing your sense of identity. And this is what opens up the world to people.
Well, and then that's exactly what Shakespeare's history plays are about. I mean, why should someone watch people act out the parts of Julius Caesar and Richard III and King John and Antony and Cleopatra, when they could just pick up a history book and read about what happens? And we all know how the stories end anyway.
Right.
The value isn't in what the story itself is. It's in the characters, and how, regardless of whether this is how the real Julius Caesar or the real Cleopatra reacted and behaved in that situation, it is a universal type applicable to every individual fit into that particular person at that particular time in history. And whether you call it Julius Caesar or make up an entirely new character, or make up a character based on a historical or a legendary person, it's going to be the same. You're molding this universal into a particular time, place, and person, to make the story coherent, and ironically, to make it speak more easily to the individual viewer. You're making these ideas manifest through a person, just like each one of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in Julius Caesar, for example, have God, the names are escaping me right now, but he says, and I'm sure you'll remember the name. The problem is not in our stars, but in our.
That's Cassius.
Yeah, Cassius says this to Brutus, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah,
The problem is not in our stars, but in ourselves.
For we are underlings. And I mean, that's a very profound point, that, they're talking about what's really shaping our fate, right? Is it the stars? Is it something if our fate is, not working out, is it because there's something wrong with our stars, or is there something wrong with us?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something wrong with our thinking? And I mean, if you think about the way a lot of people view their relationship, all right, so we're talking about Shakespeare and history, and, being on the stage of history, never mind the Stratford wooden stage, the literal stage, right? The question is, what does it mean to be on the stage of history? How does one act on the stage of history? But most people today, and I think this isn't, this is a cultural problem. This is an identity problem. It's not a question of taste or style. People identify themselves as these atomized individuals in this greater society, and most people struggle with how to reconcile their individuality with the greater unfolding of their society and history. They're not really sure how one intervenes into history, or how one plays a role in history. And so, a lot of people feel kind of helpless or hopeless when they look at a lot of the tragedies unfolding in the world. But if you think about what Cassius and Brutus are discussing, is the problem in our stars? Is the problem in this greater society that's just unfolding before me like a tragedy, and I'm just an audience, I'm just a viewer? Or am I a conscious actor in this tragedy, in this play? What is my role? Right? What is my role on the stage? Am I an actor or just a viewer? Is this really about our stars, or is this about ourselves and how we view ourselves? And I think Shakespeare, this is the genius of Shakespeare. He's identifying all these different individuals. And when we look at how they think, and then we look at the problems that occur, right? The problems are really happening at the level of ideas, at the level of thought. It's not the literal actions that are really the issue.
And that's why we still read him today, and that's why he was popular in translation, and Verdi made operas out of Shakespeare plays.
Yes.
Because they appeal beyond both the time and the place of when the play takes place and of Shakespeare's own day.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think this is what modernism has sort of failed to capture. And I mean, I think even a lot of the modernist critics, they'll sort of describe what modernism is as a sort of reaction to a changing world, a reaction to World War I, World War II, and there's a sort of a despair, right? A sense of despair in a lot of the world when we look at the kind of, when they're thinking about the kinds of horrors that have unfolded. But modernism doesn't really sort of propose any sort of modernist thinkers in their works, I should say, it's more just a reflection of that. There's not really much of an active sort of dialogue with past poets or thinkers about what this means today. You know, like what is the role of the modernist artist in relation to the political, the social, the cultural sphere, which if you read Shakespeare, if you read Dante, if you read Homer, there are all these lessons, there's all this wisdom. And in modernism, it's not trying. Their goal, as you describe in your essay series on clarity versus obscurity, you can take modernist writer after modernist writer, T.S. Eliot, Yeats, Odin, D.H. Lawrence. All these people had different. They had a different idea about what they were trying to do with their art, and it was for a very small audience, arguably. Modernism wasn't really there to be, performed on the stage for all of the population to see. There wasn't really anything for people to relate to in many cases, right? Because
You might be able to say their audience was themselves, and that's been the problem with art ever since. Because they weren't writing for a popular consumption on one hand, and they weren't writing for princes, statesmen, people who are have the ability to direct affairs, who tend to be practical minded. They were writing for themselves, and that's been the curse of art ever since. And I want to kind of back up too. You could say that modernism's failure to address those issues, those massive issues of the day, was the hugest dereliction of duty in the history of art. And it was unprecedented in that regard. I mean, art in its time has always addressed the big questions, the tough to tackle issues. Look at Shelley and Keats, or Keats to a lesser extent, dealing with Napoleon and the 30-year long revolutionary and Napoleonic wars, and all the ideas involved with that. They tackled those questions. In modernism, you had the collapse of a civilization, really. You had the rise of some of the most bloodthirsty ideologies and regimes that history has known. And really, they're writing works that have no core meaning, that don't explore these, that just throw up their hands and say, oh, read from it what you will.
yeah, I mean, just in a, if I were to ask the question, because I mean, we don't want this to sound, the point is not to say that all art has to take some political position or stance or whatnot. It's actually quite the opposite. A lot of art does that today. But I think the question that I would ask a modernist is, what advice does Eliot, what kind of wisdom can, a political leader or statesman really gain from reading Eliot? What kind of wisdom is this person really going to get? Is there really anything there? And I think the
Yeah.
answer is no. There really isn't, because Eliot doesn't really care about these things. But that's not the case if you read Shelley, if you read Shakespeare, if you read Dante, if you read Homer, if you read Keats, right? It's all about a certain idea of creativity and of the function of creativity. And I mean, it's this function of creativity which allows people to make discoveries and to sort of transcend the limits of just their time and place, their sense perception. I think this is what the real idea of wisdom is about, right? It's going beyond the particulars, going beyond our own just local experience of things, and trying to understand that within the greater unfolding of the universe and what role we are playing in that.
Because that's what makes the local and the immediate ultimately make sense.
Right.
If all you have is what you can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell, there's going to be a lot of unanswered questions, and you're not going to know how to react to the stimuli.
Yeah, they're just facts. Those are what facts are. The facts are what we can observe, but we don't know what this means. They're just facts.
But if we take that collective knowledge of what has gone before and what is stated at a universal, an ideal level, so to speak, you can make sense of the immediate and govern your actions accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
That's what art does. That's what drama does.
Right. I mean, I think it's important. There's two aspects in all art. There's a feeling question, right? Because the idea is not that somehow, I think people sometimes confound, or like Eliot, right? He criticized Hamlet because he said it lacked an objective correlative. He was saying that the scenes and the story don't match up with the emotions, and that like it's not really believable. There's this whole thing about whether something is believable or not.
Yeah, because Shakespeare doesn't come out right out and tell us what Hamlet's problem is.
Exactly.
But if
there's a feeling, just to say that there's a feeling aspect, and there's also a question of ideas, but great art unites those two. You know what I mean? Like we can all observe that we all have feelings, but we can also observe that when we investigate these feelings, they may mean different things, right? Just because we feel something is good, it doesn't actually mean it's good for us.
And which one of us hasn't had a feeling that we thought was inexplicable at one time or another?
Right.
And that's what I think Shakespeare is conveying. There doesn't necessarily have to be a reason for it. Hamlet's exploring his inner feelings without finding an explanation for them or revealing it to the audience, as much as any of us does when we're faced with those feelings.
Well, I mean, I think the point is that these feelings can be investigated. They're not an end in of themselves, right? Feelings exist there, to guide us in all sorts of different ways. But I mean, feelings of themselves are not objective truths. And
well, yeah, of course. What I was saying is that that's open for the reader, the audience to explore, and that's the problem T.S. Eliot finds with Hamlet, is that the play doesn't do that for the reader.
Right, but I think the problem with Eliot is that he doesn't get what the greater idea that Shakespeare is presenting, that it's not just about, and I guess we were discussing before, this will get us to the question of this article from the Natural History magazine called Shakespeare in the Bush. But the feelings, right? Yeah, Eliot struggles with the feelings, but the question is, what is the greater paradox that Shakespeare is presenting about Hamlet, his situation within the state of Denmark, right? And that Denmark is threatened by a hostile foreign enemy. But the whole time that there's this, potential hostile enemy that's getting ready to invade Denmark, the House of Denmark, the royalty is killing itself, right? The nation is destroying itself, so that at the end of Hamlet, the enemy walks right in.
Yeah.
Brass walks right in. So, I mean, Shakespeare, this is a very profound point, and we could say that about the United States today, where this is generally known, that if you want to destroy a nation, it's not really through external military force or even occupation. These things may work initially, but really the way to destroy a nation, if you're an empire, is to get the nation to destroy itself, right? To induce its own destruction culturally, philosophically. And so Shakespeare is looking at all that. Denmark is killing itself. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark. And yes. So if Eliot wants to make sense of everything going on within Hamlet's personal life, I mean, yeah, we all have all sorts of different feelings for different reasons, but that's not the subject. The point is that Hamlet is lost within that sphere of feeling and emotions, and he fails to see the higher dynamic that's unfolding. He's unable to act on it because he's full of, desire for revenge and angst and betrayal, which are all real feelings, but they've lost touch with the greater unfolding of history. And so Hamlet he is essentially blinded, and he's not able to function in any sort of capacity to really make decisions or defend his nation. And this goes for anybody, right? This can be the same problem for any individual. It's not just for princes or kings. It's not just their problem. It's our problem too, I guess.
Exactly, which is why we're interested in it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's saying something.
Can I pause here for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'll step right back. Just give me a minute. Well, I apologize for that hiatus, when you have young kids.
No worries.
So where were we?
We were talking about, we were in mid-thought. I think we're going to have to rediscover where we were. There's no way to capture the magic of the moment. We're going to have to rediscover that.
No, that's both the blessing and the curse of this format.
Yeah.
But I think where you wanted to go was to talk about that Shakespeare in the Bush article.
Right. Well, yeah, there's this very famous article called Shakespeare in the Bush, which was published by Nature magazine. And I believe it's from the 60s. It's an old article, but it's continuously been one of the most read articles. And it just recounts the story of an anthropologist who goes to live with a tribe of people in West Africa. And it comes to a point where she was reading Hamlet, and she said that she was convinced Hamlet was universal. But as time went on, she was living with the tribe, and they were a storytelling people, and they like to tell stories, and they like to drink beer and smoke and just tell stories and have a good old time, which, I mean, everybody can relate to that in some degree. But so what's interesting is that, so she was just listening to their stories for the longest time, but finally they tell her, you need to tell us a story. I mean, we've been telling you stories. We're not going to tell you any more stories unless you tell us a story. It was on a rainy day and they were all trapped inside. And they started drinking beer in the morning, and it just went on for all day. And they were telling stories. And so she said, oh, great, I'm going to talk about Hamlet. And as she recounts the story of how she's trying to explain the plot, right? Explain the story of Hamlet. She's saying, one brother dies, the king dies. She says the king dies, and then his brother takes over and he marries the mom, and Hamlet's all upset about this. And she starts by saying in the beginning, the ghost of Hamlet's father appears, and he's there, and Polonius, it's Horatio, and Hamlet, they see him and they talk to him, and they say, well, stop right there. How could this dead guy be seen or talk to them? If he's dead, he's a spirit. Or okay, you mean it's like a witch that came in the form of a spirit or something? They're like, you have to, they weren't buying the idea that the father of Hamlet's ghost just appeared and started talking to them. That's not how the living dead work, in their...
Yeah, you're either a reanimated corpse, or it's an image that's been conjured by a witch.
Right, exactly. It couldn't actually be the ghost of Hamlet's father. And so she gets a bit thrown off by that. She's like, okay, well, and then she keeps telling the story, and she's like, well, then, the brother died, the king died, so his brother took over, and he married the mom within a month. And, Hamlet was very upset about that. And it's like, isn't that terrible? And you know, the tribe, the chief says, "What are you talking
That's
about?"
what should happen.
Yeah, what were they supposed to do? You know, this politics and, you know, matters of the state. These are for the elders. It's not for little kids. You know, like they did the right thing. And you know, the chief was shocked that, wait, he only had one wife. You know, they're like, what do you mean one wife? That's terrible. You know, you need many wives so that, you know, how are you going to provide drink and food for everybody? And, you know, you need to have a lot of extra pairs of hands to sort of have a community run smoothly and, you know, in harmony. So, but the whole point is that, okay, so the lady's all thrown off. What's her name? Her name is Shakespeare in the Bush by Laura Bohannon. And she's all thrown off when she's trying to tell the story. And she's surprised that, you know, she's not able to really get through to them what the, you know, the tension is. But, and so through this whole thing of her trying to tell the story, she realizes, she says that she came to a realization that Hamlet is not universal. And I mean, the tribe didn't like her story, that was a terrible story. So this begs the question, is this just a question of taste? What's the real subject of Hamlet? What's Shakespeare's actual subject? Is it really matter per se that the father, the brother married his dead brother's wife, and, you know, 1 month after, and, you know, what a terrible mom, what a terrible wife. She doesn't even need time to grieve. And, you know, the father is betrayed. Claudius, the new king, has betrayed his brother, and, you know, Hamlet's trying to prove it. But these are all the predicates. These are just the facts of the story. They're not the real subject. They're just, you know, in Plato's terms, these are the shadows on the stage. This is the story unfolding on the stage. But the whole point of Shakespeare is to direct your imagination away from what's happening immediately before you on the stage to what's happening off the stage, to the actual ideas that are guiding the development of the process that we experience through our senses. And in the case of Hamlet, neither Laura Bohannon or the tribe really discuss or get to discuss the essential question of statecraft, which is posed in Hamlet, which is that you have this enemy outside of Denmark, which is coming after Denmark. And these people, Hamlet is all caught up in his internal struggles, and he's completely blind to the greater historical dynamic that's unfolding, right? He's not able to deal with the fate of his dynasty, of the royalty. And, you know, the enemy walks right in at the end again, which is there's the rub. So the enemy didn't have to do anything. And why is that? You know, what were the questions that Hamlet dealt with, and how did he deal with them? And, you know, what are the results? And so what was wrong with Hamlet's thinking? This article, Shakespeare in the Bush, from the Natural History magazine, it doesn't even touch on any of these things. The discussion was centered on the predicates of the story, the facts of the story, and it never got to the higher metaphorical idea that all these facts were meant to convey. And that shows a real failure. I think it's not even Laura, Miss Bonahan, is just really a product of the time, that this is really how people talk about Shakespeare today. It's just descriptive, it's literal, but they get caught in these sort of melodrama aspect of it, because this is what's on TV. This is what's in cinemas. It's all about the individual and their personal struggles and whatnot, but there's no higher context in which there's no higher sense, there's no higher sense of universals at play. You know, the universe is not really a factor or a subject or anything really, you know, being considered in the actions on the stage or the actions in a movie. And I think this is what Shakespeare's really getting at, though. He's really posing a fundamental paradox about what is the nature of the world we live in, and how we approach our actions within the world, that's what tells us what we really believe about the world. The way we approach a given problem, approach a given world, it's the approach, it's the treatment, which itself tells us something about what we hold to be true as fundamental truths, such that we make the decisions that we make and believe the things that we believe. So this higher level, this is the real drama. This is where everything's unfolding. And I think the point is that this is how history works. History is not what we see on TV. It's not just the narrative that we're given, right? And I mean, it's funny to observe, like in most Shakespeare plays, there's a conspiracy, right? But today, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you're crazy. And I mean, there's a lot of crazy conspiracies. But if you think about it, the idea that there are not conspiracies, that everything is just as it appears, and what Prime Minister A and President B say about XYZ subject, that's really the whole story and nothing else, as if there wasn't something happening behind the scenes which might indicate a completely different reality. And as if we don't have access to that, as if we don't have insight, right? As if we're just supposed to watch these characters on the stage and think no further.
Or as if people don't interact. Conspiracy is a crime and people get convicted of it on a fairly regular basis. So it does happen.
Right.
And you could say now, or our conversations leading up to this was a conspiracy to create a podcast. I mean, that's the nature of human interaction. You get together and you plan things. Right. And, sometimes you plan something fun or innocuous, and, sometimes destructive. I don't know where we were going with this.
I mean, yeah, not to talk too much, but I think that the problem is that most people, or people who are saying there are no conspiracies, well, here's the rub. It's because they're not involved in any. And so if you're not involved in a conspiracy, it's a lot harder to conceive that other people might be involved in conspiracies, right? And I think this is important from a Shakespearean standpoint in understanding the question of evil, which a lot of Shakespeare's plays are dealing with in one sense or another, right? There's a battle between good and evil, however you want to define these terms, right? It's not there's good guys and there's bad guys, but there are certain principles which are either being violated, fought for, and this is what's driving the individual parts, right? There's a whole, there's something from the top driving the parts. And I think a lot of people have trouble with this idea of evil, right? In the same way that a lot of the characters struggle to fully ascertain the level of conspiracy that's unfolding before them. For example, in Othello, right? There's Iago the Venetian, who's sort of whispering in everybody's ear.
Who is the puppet master behind the whole play.
Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare didn't just write that because he thought it was a good story. It's because that's a historical reality, that a lot of politics, a lot of the subversion of entire nations and civilizations is done that way. And Shakespeare is presenting that. That's a historical fact, that nations are subverted, people are subverted. I mean, there's infinite evidence for that if you look at the greater whole of history. And I think the problem is that today, and largely because of the art, largely because of the worldview or the underlying philosophical assumptions about what art's purpose is as a form of distraction, entertainment, it no longer brings people into this higher dynamic. It no longer poses these more fundamental paradoxes. And so, yeah, there's no conspiracies. Everything is what it looks like, which was never. That was never like that.
Well, and that you might argue that that's a byproduct of the superficiality of most popular entertainment. What you see on the screen or read in the Harlequin novel is what you get. There's no reading between the lines. There's no universals to consider. And, people apply that to the news or what they see unfolding before them in events unfolding in real time,
Right.
and they don't have that critical eye toward it, which is a very dangerous thing, particularly if you're basing people who hold power on a popular vote of some sort.
Right. I mean, this is a profound question because you're right. Yeah, the work that one has to do to uh, really understand and grapple with the questions posed in a great classic like Dante's Commedia or a Shakespeare drama or a tragedy by Aeschylus, that kind of thinking, right, that struggle with these paradoxes and ideas is the kind of thinking that people can then take into the real world and actually inform them in real world situations, not as a prescriptive knowledge, but as an approach to thinking, an approach to ideas, right? And a sense of causality that goes beyond just, the pairwise interaction of people and things in your local environment. There's a higher lawfulness in the world, in history. There always has been. And so if people lose that, I mean, it's very interesting in Brave New World, Aldous Huxley. I listened to the whole audiobook while I was working recently. That's one of the benefits of the COVID, lockdown. I mean, I'm just at home. I work on a computer and now I listen to podcasts and I listen to the audiobooks. And Huxley, at one point, one of the characters says that people have to choose between happiness and high art. Happiness and high art. What does Huxley mean by that? Huxley understands this question in a certain sense because, and the person says, what are you talking about? Why can't we read Shakespeare? Because they were talking about Shakespeare, and the character is telling him, the doctor's telling him, no, people can't have Shakespeare today. It's not for them. They want to be happy. They want to be content. And he says, why can't we read Shakespeare in this beautiful language and all this richness of thought? And he says, because there's tragedy in Shakespeare. And there is no
that was
tragedy.
upsetting to the dystopian world envisioned.
Well, there's supposed to be no tragedy. There's no notion of good or bad. There's just contentness. And that's what Shakespeare Algis is getting at. It's really an oligarchical outlook, right, of just contenting the masses. There's no good, there's no bad, there's no pain, there's no suffering, there's no joy. It's just you're content. I mean, if something goes wrong, you have soma, right? You have, today, I guess they'd call it marijuana, right? You just, there are ways to cope. There's synthetic music, right? These are real things in a brave new world. People have synthetic music, they have sex, they have drugs, and they're sort of just numbed and contented by that. And he says, don't introduce Shakespeare into all of this. You're gonna mess this all up. You're gonna confuse people because in Shakespeare there are choices to be made. There are consequences, right? There are different levels of action and consequences to these actions. And an enslaved utopian mass, they don't have to think about these problems. That's the whole idea. So yeah, sure, you don't have to think about these problems. So we have entertainment. Here, go listen to this music or watch this. But
that's the same dystopian idea that was created in Ray Bradbury's sci-fi novel Fahrenheit 451. In there, it's the same idea where you have this dystopia that it's just contentment in physical and sensual pleasure, and there are these brigades called the fire squads, but instead of putting out fires, their job is to burn books that they find, because the ideas they contain, present a threat to this world of contentment that's been created.
Right, where no change really happens and everything is quote unquote stable, and stability is the key, right? If you don't have stability, God forbid, if things are changing, if there's progress, This is a big problem if you're trying to keep everybody in place, right? And you're trying to make sure, the wrong ideas don't get out and people don't start getting their own ideas, right? Or thinking for themselves. That becomes a big problem. So yeah, it's this question of art and entertainment, its role, this question of high art, which even Huxley identifies. I mean, this is no small question. I mean, in the Brave New World, Shakespeare is being kept from the population so that they can't actually have access to, even at one earlier point in the book, there's just this scene where the guy describes being angry and being totally enraged, but he never had the words. He never had the means of expressing it in words and language until he read Macbeth, and a point where Macbeth is going crazy. And he finally found some expression, a kind of language that could articulate what he was actually feeling. And I mean, I think that's a very profound point about language. And, another, crucial aspect of Shakespeare is developing the kind of complex and nuanced language which allows you to actually describe the real universe and describe reality in precise terms that you can't if you're confined to a purely literal or descriptive sense of the world, right? Because you can't really talk about ideas if you're just talking in literal terms, if you're just talking about happy and sad. I mean, nobody's ever just happy or just sad, right? The world is just more complex. And there is language that can reflect this complexity. And that's the purpose, right? Is to be able to, as you develop this language, these metaphors, you're able to give some sort of expression to your ideas and allow them to materialize and allow them to be conveyed and communicated and to become an actual force within the world, which you can't do if you don't really know how to talk or communicate, which a lot of it comes from learning how to read and language. So, it's no small question being able to read Shakespeare and understand the deeper themes. I mean, this is a fountain of timeless wisdom, and this is why it's kept from the population in A Brave New World. And from what you're saying in Fahrenheit
451. Yeah, exactly. It's a common theme throughout both works, and you could find it in others too. Great literature to those who want to control, because it empowers the individual to think for himself, to find the ideas. I won't say come up with the ideas, but to find the ideas that are there.
Right. And I mean, I think the problem with modernism, and I mean, with a lot of things, as a historical sort of development, it's that if you can't destroy something, you pervert it, or you create new approaches, new ways of, you deconstruct it, so to speak, so that you don't even know what you're looking at anymore. I mean, you get so existential about, you can't even say the orange is on a desk anymore. That's like, who knows what that means? People are so confused. And so people aren't really reading Shakespeare as classical tragedy. They're reading it as some sort of modernist, postmodernist, existential outlook on the world, and sort of superimposing that onto, the problems of Hamlet, which makes absolutely no sense. And I mean, but we could do this in a million different ways. I think the point is that we have to investigate our assumptions and our axioms, and those actually reveal what kind of world we're living in, what kind of world we believe to be living in. And this is the real subject. What universe are we in? This is what a poet is really describing, right? They're giving us their view of a universe. And I think the challenge for any reader with any, not just poetry, but really any hypothesis, is saying, well, what does this universe actually look like?
And more importantly, it's a universe that the reader can recognize just as much as the poet.
Mhm.
And that's where modernism falls short, is it says, well, I'm presenting you, we'll call it a universe, and each reader is going to see it differently and really wrong, which could mean all of them are wrong. So there's nothing there. What the poet does is to present a universe in terms that the poet knows every reader will be able to recognize. Now, you might have someone
With the work,
pull us. What's that?
with the work, right? If one does,
Exactly, and that determines the success or failure of a poem. And by that standard, you could argue all modernist poetry is a failure because it's intended to be. But be that as it may, an individual reader may take slightly different things from it, but it's there's going to be a fundamental truth that underlies the work, and you're going to be able. No one's going to take,
take that
for
away.
example, from beauty is truth, truth is beauty. No one's going to take a message that says, oh, there's no such thing as beauty and it's all in the eye of the beholder. You can't read that. The idea is there. The idea is easily understood. And while it might be nuanced, it's not going to change.
Right. And I mean, well, one of the ultimate ironies in all this is that even if you say there is no beauty, there is no truth, that's asserting a truth.
Exactly.
And that one just flies by most people. I mean, you hear the kind of relativist arguments that they're making, but they're really saying that the truth is that there is no truth. So the question is, so you're saying this is true? What you're saying, your words are true? And that, I mean, they're making the most sweeping of all statements, which is the great irony. People who say there's such thing as knowable truth aren't saying they know every single truth, in the universe, that they know all the truths of the universe, or that they know the absolute truth. They're just asserting that human beings have a capacity of knowing more than just relativistic, values, and having sort of changing knowledge of things. There are principles which organize the universe, which the human species can discover not through the senses but through the mind. And great art gives us the ability to develop those higher faculties in human beings, which are necessary to actually deal with and discuss, right, elaborate and investigate that level of nuance and complexity, right, which happens at the level of metaphor and ideas rather than at the literal or descriptive level of the world.
Well, exactly. And that's, again, we touched on this in the last podcast, that's what metaphor is. It's the transference of the idea from the concrete into the abstract, into the transcendental. And that's what poetry does.
Right. And I mean, yeah, we were saying how, they don't, we were just saying something about how they're right. People are saying, there's this thing that there's no truth, right? There's somebody who's asserting there are truths that are knowable, and it's often taken as a sort of extremist view today that there is an absolute truth. Doesn't mean we can know it all, but there is a means by which the human mind can attain a higher knowledge of truth than just pure sense perception. But the other side is saying, well, there is no truth, right? It's all relative. There is no normal. There is no this or that. But that's the most sweeping statement you could possibly make, because you're saying that there is no truth. That's a sweeping statement. And I mean, this is reflected in the art of a lot of the modernists. Of course, there are exceptions, but I mean, as far as it is, under the banner of modernism, right? It's this idea that we're just really dealing with effects. we're dealing with style, we're dealing with pure language, right? And what putting one word beside another word or one image with another image, what does that feel like? What's that sort of idiosyncratic or peculiar sort of effect that's going to create for the reader? But that's really what its purpose is.
Well, yeah, that you've summed it up. I don't know what to add to that.
I mean, I think we're at a crossroads, right? There's a question about, well, if art isn't just going to be about effects, how do we go? I don't want to say, it's not how do we go back, but how do we once again recognize?
How do we pick up where we left off?
Yeah, that's not a bad way to put it, in the sense that there's progress, and progress always happens within a sort of historical context, right? We're building off the work of others. And I mean, there has to, with the French Revolution, right? The idea was forget the past, right? Forget everything that was before. It's a clean break.
And the year zero mentality.
Pardon me?
That's the year zero mentality.
Right. There's this year zero mentality. Modernism sort of had the same thing. Ezra Pound's injunction was make it new.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess a place to sort of end here would be that I think the injunction for artists today should be make it timeless.
I couldn't agree with that more. And we've touched a bit. I think really the whole focus of this podcast was, what is timelessness? What makes a work timeless? What makes it high art? And I think we've answered the question and then posed it at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is it always has to be rediscovered, right? Because we're in a new, quote unquote, modern context, right? We don't live in, Shakespeare's England or Homer's ancient Greece. So of course, whatever timeless art is born today will reflect the age that it's born in, right? We're not ignoring the world in which we're in, but there's also something more. And it's that question of more, which we can understand by looking at the past timeless works of others, where the time and place in which they were written no longer exists. And yet there's still something enduring about what these things are saying, about what these great works of art are saying. And it's that unchanging aspect. I think that's what the subject of investigation, that's what we want to, investigate today, and be like, what does that look like today? I think that's really all, that's more the issue. We just want to be open and wonder, what might this look like today? What does timeless art look like in the 21st century?
And I think it will look in many ways very similar to how it did in any other century, in any other time and place, but addressing our own unique circumstances. That's what makes great literature so exciting to read. Is on the one hand, there's that familiarity, that almost intimacy you have with the character, the story, the situation, and yet there's that exoticity, that adventurousness of experiencing something from a different time and place. And I think it's the combination of those that makes historical literature or classic literature, both relevant and enduring.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think this is a great place to just end.
Sure.
These are
that was kind of anticlimactic, my last comment, but no, I agree.
Big questions, and we're not really. I think the questions are more important than the answers right now.
Yep, because we're answering them as we go along.
Yeah. So I thank you, Adam, for joining us, and I thank you, everybody, for listening. We have a lot more to talk about. We have a lot of subjects that we want to discuss. This has just been the beginning of a discussion about modernism and the future of art, but we have a lot more to talk about. So I invite everybody to join us again next week. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Dave.
Take care.
You too.